So far, I talked about hierarchy and balance because these are the most important design principles. Hierarchy helps us understand the space, while balance helps the space just feel right. Now we're going to talk about what I'd call secondary principles, which help us establish hierarchy and balance and also can have effects on their own. These principles are contrast, rhythm, alignment, and proximity. Contrast is a design principle that we use when we want to emphasize the difference between two things. So, for example, if we want to emphasize the difference in size between two things, then we probably want to increase the contrast if we want to make the big element look bigger, and so we might want to do this. Or we might want to increase the contrast not only in size, but also in material finish. In this way, we can use different elements to improve the contrast. And the reason we actually want to use the contrast and the reason that we want to emphasize the difference is that sometimes we want to use the contrast to improve the hierarchy of the image, and sometimes we simply want to use contrast to make some elements more visible against the backdrop. So these are the two ways that we use contrast as a design principle. Second design principle that I would like to talk about now is repetition or rhythm. Now, repetition is very inherent in architecture, and the dealing with repetition is very important because by nature, architectural compositions are often repetitive. That's because of the program, because we often get programs such as we need to make a building with 200 offices, and also because of the structure, because we can use repetition to evenly distribute the load. And so as an architect, it's very important to know how to deal with repetition, especially because repetition is something that people usually perceive as boring. So if we take one visual element and repeat it over the same distance, we will get what we could call a monotonous rhythm. It's an equivalent of repeating the same note in music all over again, or the same, let's say, drum sound. We get what we call in music, as well as in visual arts, a monotonous rhythm. On the other hand, if we try to vary either the shape that we're repeating or the distance between them, we can make this composition more playful, and as a matter of fact, we can graduate, let's say, the playfulness of the composition by the way we vary elements such as windows. Sometimes we want to, because of the nature of the building we want to make a building very playful for some sort of uses, while other sort of uses would maybe require something more serious or, let's say, more monotonous rhythm. Also, it's important to say that rhythm or repetition helps us understand space better. Let me just show you a simple example where we can use very similar elements and repeat them. Now, by using this, by repeating the same element, by varying the size, we, in a way, help our brains understand the composition better, because although we might say the repetition is boring, our brains often like repetition because it's something that we can instinctively understand. Another thing that's very important to say when we talk about repetition, if we have a same visual element, say window, and we repeat it in the same monotonous way, but we make the window so small, then at one point we will stop seeing windows, and we will see all these windows, we will stop seeing, individual windows, and we will start perceive all these group of small repetitive windows as one visual element, as a pattern. So always having scale in mind when you think about repetition in architecture. Third visual element or design principle that I want to discuss now is alignment. And alignment is a design principle where we position elements in such a way so that their edges are perceived as basically positioned on the same line. Now, in general, as a rule of thumb, alignment in architecture helps us conceive a more ordered composition and less complex spaces. And sometimes we have to measure which is the thing that's more important to us. When I say less complex, the reason why that happens is that there's a certain sort of visual effect that occurs in our brain when we see aligned images or aligned forms, and that's called closure. Closure is a tendency of our brain to complete incomplete shapes. That's why we sometimes can see pandas or circles where they actually do not exist. The same thing happens in architecture. That's why alignment usually helps us perceive spaces as something more simple. However, we don't always want to have a simple ordered space. And we can see the example if we contrast a typical modern city, such as a Manhattan city grid, with a medieval city where all these buildings are, none of the buildings are aligned, and they form, let's say, a network of really complex spaces. What we have on one side, on Manhattan, we have a very simple way to orient us, and we perceive space in a very simple way. But on the other hand, in the medieval city, what we get is a very rich spatial experience, because we get to experience space square, corner by corner, a little plaza by plaza, and in the end, we feel that our perception of space is something that we just feel much better about it. Finally, the final design principle I would like to talk about is proximity, which is very simple. It just says things that are grouped together are perceived as one element. And so whatever, especially when we deal with the complex compositions, we want to try to group elements together so that these elements could be perceived as one element instead, and so we simplify the composition. So there we have four secondary design principles, which are contrast, rhythm, alignment, and proximity. In next video, we will see how to put all these together into one creative workflow.